Some people tell me that they will not believe in God until they have seen a miracle. And I usually tell them, what is the oldest book you have in your house? Now, I have a book that was printed in 1850, and many people think that's a really an old book. And I ask them, is that an old book, a book that was made in 1850, 150 years ago? Because you have a book that was started to be compiled 3,500 years ago. That's how old the Bible, the Old Testament is. Because Moses started to write the Old Testament about 3,500 years before Christ. So I tell people that you have a miracle. You have the Word of God. So today I will go through some of the main points of the how the Old Testament was protected and compiled. And I'll start with the first word in the Old Testament, Bereshit. But before I explain what Bereshit means, I need to explain that the original ancient Hebrew writing was not in letters. They did not have an alphabet as we have. They had pictures like the Egyptians and the Chinese today. And they had 22 pictures. And all the books in the Old Testament before the year 600 BC were written with these pictures and not with letters. For example, the first letter is Aleph, but it was not a letter, it was a picture. And it was a picture of an ox head, because the ox head was the most powerful of the tame animals. So when we have Aleph alone, it is describing the strongest. So when you see Aleph alone in the text, it refers to God. But if you have Aleph and another picture, then these two are combined, and it gives a different meaning. It gives the strongest of the other letter. An example of that is Abba, or father. Now, Abba, it would be spelt with an Aleph, that's an ox head, and a Beth. And a Beth is a drawing of a tent or a house. But in those days, it was a tent. That's where they lived. So Abba would be Aleph Beth, which is the strongest in the house. And who is the strongest in the house? Well, maybe today that could be negotiated, but in history, that is the father. The father is the strongest in the house. That's what Abba means. So it is using these pictures that all of the books of the Old Testament up to the year 600 BC were written. And the first word of the Hebrew Bible is Bereshit. And Bereshit shows that the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament, are combined. It is the message of the Bible in a nutshell. Let me explain what Bereshit means. It starts with the letter Beth, which is a house, picture of a tent. Then it is the letter of a person. And when these two are combined, it's not the father, it's someone else, because the father is Aleph Beth. So when Beth and Resh, the other letter, it is saying it is the son. That is the Hebrew word for the son. These two letters, Aleph and Resh. The next letter in Bereshit is Aleph, the strongest. So when these three letters are combined, the tent, the Resh, a person, and Aleph, it is the Son of God. Because we have Aleph in these three letters. So it's not only the Son, which is the first two letters, but is the Son of God. And then we come to the next letter, Shine, which is this. The symbol is drawn by two teeth, and these two teeth represent destruction. So these letters or drawings in the word up to here means that the Son of God will suffer. The next letter is the letter Yod, and it is drawn as a hand. And it can mean different things, but in this case, it means voluntarily. So here we see that the Son of God will suffer voluntarily. And the last letter in Bereshit is a cross. And it can mean death, but it can also mean covenant. So in this one word, the first word in the Hebrew Bible, Bereshit, meaning the beginning. In the English Bible, the first word is in the beginning. But in the Hebrew Torah, it is Bereshit, beginning. And in this word, you have the story of the Bible in a nutshell. The Son of God will suffer voluntarily and die, or it will be a covenant. When Ezra returned from Babylon about 500 BC, he changed the Hebrew pictures to the letters that we have today. Why did he do so? We don't know, but the scholars believe that he did so to protect the text from being corrupted by the Samaritan books. The Samaritan had the 5 books of Moses. That was their Bible. They didn't have the prophets and the other books. But the Samaritans, they had the 5 books of Moses. And these books had been corrupted during time. So some scholars believe that he did so to protect the text, that it is not confused with the Samaritan text. Now, the original ancient Hebrew letters were the basis of the Greek letters. If you go to the British Museum and you go through the area where they have the Egyptian the pharaohs and artifacts from Egypt, the Rosetta Stone, and you go through that part, and you go to the end of that section, and then you go down the steps to the left when you've gone through that whole section. You come to an area where there are languages. There's a section about languages, and there's a plaque on the wall explaining how the Greek language developed from the ancient Hebrew languages. The Greek letters are based on the Hebrew letters, but they're turned around because we read from left to right, but the Hebrews read from right to left. So the Greeks turned around the letters, and you can see some of those if you look closely. So the Hebrew letters actually had some influence, much greater than we understand. Now, why is it called the Old Testament and the New Testament? Is the Old Testament a testament? I would say no, but it comes from a translation of the Greek word diatheke. There are 2 words in Greek for covenant. One is syntheke, and that is a covenant which can be negotiated, an agreement that you can negotiate. But diatheke is an agreement you cannot negotiate. And you cannot negotiate your covenant with God. He gives you the covenant, but you cannot negotiate. You cannot say, I don't like this part, but I like this part. No, you have to accept the whole agreement. And that is why it is diatheke. That is why the Greek word is used. And when the Bible translated to Latin, Diatheka was translated not covenant, but testament. And later Bible versions were influenced by this, and therefore the Old and the New Testament got its names. But the correct titles should be the Old Covenants, because there are a number of covenants in what we call the Old Testament, and the New Covenant. That would be the more correct titles for the part. Okay, I'd like to comment on a few of the books of the Old Testament. The book of Job is probably the oldest book in the Bible. And there are many theories of who wrote the book of Job. Some believe it was Moses. Others believe it was King Solomon, Isaiah. But the Talmud says it was Moses. That is what the ancient Jews believed. And there's a coin mentioned in Job chapter 42, verse 11, that was used before the year 1000. So this points to a very early date for the book of Job. The interesting thing is that Job was not an Israelite. There are only two people in the Old Testament of main characters of books that were not Israelites. And Job was one of them, and Ruth was another. And I find it quite amazing that Job was characterized by God as such a great man, one of the greatest that lived. And this book is a masterpiece in literature because the dialogue between Job and his friends were written in poem. And it is recognized as a masterpiece in literature, beautiful piece of literature. Another book I like to make a comment to is the book of Proverbs. Now, Proverbs chapter 22, verses 17 to Proverbs chapter 23 and verse 11 represents or resembles very much the Egyptian text of the teaching of Amenhotep, who was a pharaoh of Egypt. And he lived around the year 1000 BC. And the question is, who copied who? Did the Egyptian text copy the Hebrew text? Or did the Hebrew text copy the Egyptian text? And the scholars do not agree on this. They disagree. But I would not be surprised if the Egyptian pharaoh copied Solomon, because there are Hebrewisms within the Egyptian text, the way things are explained or put. But there are no influences of the Egyptian language in the Hebrew text. But it's interesting, if this is the case, that King Solomon's writings were actually copied in Egypt. Now, how did the Jews secure the original text? How did they protect the original text? And they had many ways to secure the text. They counted many aspects of the text. For example, how many words and letters in each book. And then they wrote the number at the end of the book. And they also wrote the middle word of the book. So they counted every letter, every word, and then they wrote this at the end of each book. They also counted the middle word of the Torah. And just for your information, the middle verse in the Torah is Leviticus chapter 11, verse 41. That is the middle verse in the 5 books of Moses. And they marked this with a capital letter. And if this was not the middle verse in a copy of the Torah, there was a mistake somewhere. And the copy was discarded if the mistake was not found. And they counted every letter in the Torah, and the Aleph occurs 42,377 times in the Torah. And Beth occurs 38,218 times. in the Torah. And then they counted every letter in the Hebrew Old Testament. And there are 1,152,207 letters in the Hebrew Old Testament. I might repeat that because you probably did not get that, but it was 1,152,207 letters in the Hebrew Old Testament. Now, this did not occur throughout the ages, but there was a time when the Jews did this to protect the text. Now, the Old Testament books were written on scrolls, but this changed in the 1st century AD when the book form that we have today was introduced. And the book form is called a codex. You've probably heard the name codex. And it's not mysterious, it's just the book form. For example, Codex Sinaiticus, which I'll talk about next time, the manuscript which was found in the Sinai monastery. The codex means a book. And this came into use in the 1st century AD. And many scholars believe that the copying of the Bible was a driving force of this change. And the reason why the codex replaced the scrolls is that the codex could contain all the books of the Old Testament and New Testament, while one would need many scrolls to have the Old Testament and the New Testament. For example, the book of Isaiah, you would need one scroll just for that book. The book of Ezekiel, you would need one scroll for one book. The book of the minor prophets, you need one scroll for those. And just as a comment, the minor prophets were not less in importance than the larger prophets, but they were called the minor prophets because they were shorter. They were shorter texts. So you would see you would need maybe 15 scrolls to have, or more, to have the Old Testament and the New Testament, while you could have all of those in one codex. So many scholars believe that it was the Bible that was the driving force of the change from the use of scrolls to the use of codex. Let's look at some history within the Old Testament. First of all, some scholars have said that Moses could not have written the first 5 books because writing was not invented 1,500 years before Christ. But now it has been proven that writing was invented much earlier than that, actually. So that argument does not hold water. And in Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 26, Moses said that the book of the law should be placed in the tabernacle beside the ark. Take this book of the law and put it beside the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, that it may be there as a witness against you. So here we see, first of all, Moses says the book of law did exist, and it should be stored in the tabernacle beside the ark. And this was a custom in the nations around Israel, that the holy books of their religion were placed in their own temple. So here we see this also pertains to Moses and the tabernacle. In 728 BC, the king Hezekiah made his men to clean the temple, and he enforced the rituals from the book of Moses. So they must have found the book of the law while cleansing the temple. And Hezekiah, his men collected more proverbs of Solomon, as we can see from Proverbs chapter 25, Proverbs chapter 25 and verse 1. These are the Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied. So the following chapters were more Proverbs of King Solomon, which were collected by Hezekiah. And then 100 years later, in 621 BC, the law of Moses was again found in the temple. You can read this in 2 Kings chapter 22, because again, they needed to cleanse the temple, and in doing so, they found this old book of the law of Moses. And this proves that the books were stored in the tabernacle or in the temple. And then it is interesting to read in Daniel chapter 9, verse 2, that Daniel was reading from the book of Jeremiah. Let's read Daniel chapter 9, verse 2. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by the books the number of years specified by the word of the Lord, given through Jeremiah, the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. So here was Daniel. He was brought to Babylon in 605 BC. And he was in Babylon, and he was reading from the book of Jeremiah. So this proves that the books of the temple were brought to Babylon, and that Daniel was able to read from these books, and he was now reading from the book of Jeremiah. Some scholars say that Daniel lived much later, that he lived around the year 167. But Josephus, he writes that the high priest, he met Alexander the Great, 335 BC, and showed Alexander the Great the book of Daniel, and showed him that Daniel wrote about Alexander, and Alexander changed his mind. Alexander was going to go past Jerusalem, just destroy Jerusalem on his way to Egypt. But Alexander changed his mind and passed by Jerusalem because he read of the prophecy about him in the book of Daniel. So according to the Talmud, Ezra wrote the first and second book of Chronicles, which were one book in the Hebrew Old Testament, book of Nehemiah, and the book of Ezra. The book of Nehemiah and Ezra in the Old Testament, Hebrew Old Testament, was one book. And he changed the Hebrew writing from pictures to the letters we have today. And it is possible that Ezra also wrote the book of Malachi, because Malachi means messenger. Malachi was not his real name. And no one knows who wrote the book of Malachi. But some scholars believe that it was Ezra, because the book of Malachi addresses many of the problems that Ezra had in his time. Now, the Old Testament was written in the Hebrew language, but there are 4 chapters in the book of Ezra and 6 chapters in the book of Daniel that are written in the Aramaic language. And the Aramaic language was the official state language in the Babylonian Empire. So it's not strange that Ezra and Daniel, who were in many ways the representatives of the Babylonian Empire, wrote these chapters in the Aramaic language. And the Aramaic was later used in many countries in the Middle East and also Israel. So Aramaic was the language of the day in the time of Jesus. And Aramaic was the language which was closely related to the Hebrew language. Now, the books of the Old Testament were gathered by the year 150 BC. But there were some discussion concerning a few of the books. And they were basically these three books: Ecclesiastes, the Song of Solomon, and the Book of Esther. Ecclesiastes was discussed among the rabbis because it was so negative. It had so negative understanding of life. And the rabbis didn't see the love of God in this book. The Song of Solomon was discussed because this book is quite erotic. And the rabbis could not agree that this should be a part of the Bible. But the final decision about the books of the Old Testament was made in the year 90 AD, when the Jews came together after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And they agreed that these three books should be in the Bible, and the Song of Solomon, because it shows the love of God to his people, a symbol of the love of God to his people. And the last book which was to be discussed is the Book of Esther. And the Book of Esther was not agreed upon until the year 90, because the word God does not occur in this book. And the rabbis could not understand why a book that did not contain the name of God should be a part of the Bible. But this was agreed then in the year 90 to have these books in the Bible. Jesus indirectly confirms the order of the New Testament books in Luke chapter 11, verse 51. Luke chapter 11, verse 51. And here he talks about the murder of Abel, which was from the book of Genesis, to the murder of Zechariah in the second book of Chronicles. Now, in the Hebrew Old Testament, the second book of Chronicles was the last book of their Hebrew Old Testament. So when Jesus mentions the span of time between the killing of Abel and the killing of Zechariah, he indirectly shows that Genesis was the first book and the second book of Chronicles was the last book. So indirectly he confirms then this order. The first translation of the Hebrew Old Testament was made into Greek about 250 years before Christ. And it is the famous Septuaginta. And the Septuaginta includes some books which are not regarded as part of the Old Testament by us, because the books of the Apocrypha were included in the Septuaginta. Now, Paul quotes from this Greek translation, the Septuaginta, in his epistles. So he quotes from this because the Greek translation was well known among his Greek audience. And when Jerome translated the Bible into Latin, he used the Septuaginta as the basis of the Old Testament. And that is the reason why the Catholic Church uses this version, including the Apocrypha books, in their Bible. So this is why the Catholic version of the Bible is different from ours. And I'll explain how this occurred in my next sermon when I go through the history of the Bible, history of the New Testament. So I think I'll stop there because I've given you a lot of detail, which you probably have not been able to absorb. But I hope I've given you some interesting facts about the Old Testament and how it developed.